Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Zabichand. I'm the Administration Officer at Northern Institute in Charles Darwin Uni. Before we get started, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the Larrakia Nation. As a child of the Pacific, I understand the indigenous people's connections to country, culture, customs, law, and creation spirits. I acknowledge this always was and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, that sovereignty was never ceded, and that the fight for justice continues. So welcome to our Northern Institute Visiting Academics Seminar. I would like to introduce our Associate Professor Katrien Pype from KU Leuven. She is the Associate Professor of Social and Cultural Anthropology at KU Leuven. She's been carrying out ethnographic research in Kinshasa since 2003 and has published on its media worlds, popular culture and tech creativity. Her monograph, The Making of the Pentecostal Melodrama, Religion, Media and Gender in Kinshasa, was published in 2012 with Bergen Books. She co-edited the OA books, The Post-Global City, Theorizing Technology, Cultures in Urban Africa, 2026, with Omalade Adunbi and Michael M. J. Fisher, University of Michigan Press, and Cryptopolitics. Exposure, Concealment, and Digital Media, 2023, with V. Bernal and D. Rodima Taylor, Bergen Books. She is currently a visiting fellow at Northern Institute in CDU. Today, she's going to be presenting Sea Urge, a global anthropology of climate urgency, a large-scale European research project that investigates how urgency is produced, experienced, contested, and acted upon in the context of climate change across diverse social worlds. Central to the project is an experimental methodological approach we call eco-ethnography, which combines long-term anthropological fieldwork with attention to ecological relations, temporal pressures, and moral and political demands for rapid action. As Sea Urge functions as its own complex communicative and organizational ecology, in this seminar, she will reflect on the practical and effective labor of running and inhabiting a large international research consortium. Katrien is open to taking questions online and in the room after the presentation. For those online, please add your questions to the Q&A section of the Teams webinar and chat. Thank you. Welcome, Katrien.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to talk a bit about a research project that I'm running. So before I start, I also want to acknowledge country. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Larrakia people, the saltwater people, traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we gather today. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people present. I recognize their continuing connection to land, sea, and community, and acknowledge that land and sovereignty have never been ceded. It's an honor to be here, and I can only hope that the presentation that I'll deliver today may have some impact on future research that will benefit the Larrakia people's life worlds, either by generating new knowledges or by valorizing Larrakia knowledges in future research that has been inspired by this talk, or by exposing then Larrakia vulnerabilities due to climate change. So the talk that I'm giving today is a presentation of a research project that I'm running. So it's not a presentation of what I'm doing here. So I'm on sabbatical leave at KU Leuven, and I'm spending 6 months here in Australia, 2 months Melbourne, 2 months Darwin, 2 months Sydney, to write a monograph on technology cultures in Kinshasa. And so since 2003, I've been carrying out ethnographic research in Kinshasa, now the third largest city of Africa, 18 million inhabitants. 2003, when I started, was 7.5 million. So it has exploded incredibly. And during COVID, I don't know how it was for all of you, COVID, but the COVID period made me reflect more on what kind of impact do I have as a researcher? What are the choices of my research topics? They may be valid, relevant for academia, for fundamental research, but do they make a difference in the life worlds of the people that I'm working with and writing about? That's also why I started my acknowledgement, like with hoping that this presentation may resonate with maybe some in the room here who then may be inspired to think about how this research could, find another iteration or articulation that can benefit Larakia people. So during COVID, I was thinking, like, I've written a lot about popular culture in Kinshasa, media, production of television serials, for humor, tech creativity, but in the end, the life worlds, the data that generates, the insights, don't really change. And so I started thinking we need to do something. I need to, engage with climate change, which is, one of the big problems. Not only in Kinshasa, but around the world. And luckily in Europe, I don't know how I can go to the next, luckily European funding, and maybe that's something that I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A as well, especially since Australia probably will be joining the European research area, and you'll be able to co-apply or apply independently for EU funding. So the European funding scheme, or funding landscape, actually, it's a funding landscape, is very diverse. And there's one particular type of funding that allows you to apply for funding even if you're not an expert on that particular topic, which is the doctoral training network, the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions, and I think it was in the previous slide, doctoral network. So with that kind of funding, you co-apply with some colleagues, at least 3 others, so you need to be at least 4 PIs, and you co-apply to set up a doctoral research program on a particular topic on which no university in Europe is already working on it. So the whole goal actually of this doctoral network is to set up, research programs that train cohorts in particular skills and competencies which are not yet offered. So like this is the space where I can, where I can apply for that kind of funding without, without otherwise losing any credibility. EU funding is very competitive, and the CV of the applicant is very often, equally valued as, the merits of the project in itself. With the doctoral training scheme, the focus is very much on the architecture of the training program. And you need to bring in, everybody needs to bring in something. But the idea is if it already exists in a particular department or something, then it doesn't have to be funded by that particular scheme. So, so I co-applied with, actually in the beginning we were 5. There's one man, missing, Jamie Cross, who is now at Glasgow University. Around the time that we got our funding, the UK pulled out, because of Brexit, had pulled out of the EU funding scheme, and so he couldn't get, when it was awarded, it was said the EU money cannot go to a UK university. So he then had to get into a particular track within UKRI funding scheme, research and innovation. And at the same time, he moved from institution, from Edinburgh to Glasgow, and is going to join the network, the consortium again by September. But so we then took off with 4 women, me from Leuven, the lead PI, and then a colleague from the university in Germany, Halle, a colleague from university in Catania, Sicily, Italy, and then a colleague from Uppsala, Sweden. Specifically, also for this doctoral training network, is that part of the training program that you're setting up, you need to include non-academic partners. And in the training program, you need to include what they call non-academic secondment. The EU is very much aware that PhD holders, not all PhD holders can continue in academia. The academic market is just too small. So with the doctoral network, they want to be sure that we also deliver PhD holders who have particular non-academic skills products which can make them also competitive in the non-academic market. And so you need to already have agreements of principle with some non-academic partners, and these are ours. Like in Belgium, Royal Institute of Natural Sciences. Impact Hub is on Sicily, an island, an impact and a hub where tech entrepreneurs and activists brainstorm, collaborate. One of my PhD students is currently on Mauritius. And Mauritius doing his non-academic secondment in the office of the Commission of the Indian Ocean. Stockholm Environment Institute, Ferropolis is a museum in Germany where some of the German-based PhD students are doing their non-academic secondment. So we then, when we heard that we got the funding, we published vacancies. We hired 10 PhD students. So this is also very particular. EU funding, usually you have to publish vacancies. They are not fellowships as such for PhD students. These are projects, and the PhD students get salaries and they get research money. So these are the 10, these are the 10 PhD students that are hired on this project. I'm supervising 3, all 3 working on Africa. The other 3 PIs are also supervising, so 2 or 3 PhD students. So they're all enrolled in one European PhD program, but they need to participate in the consortium-wide events that we set up online or in person. And I'm very happy to talk further about the practicalities of that in the Q&A section. But climate urgency. Why climate urgency? Why doing research on this topic? Well, I guess, climate change is a global challenge. Everybody knows that. Climate refugees and people displaced by ecosystem disruption are among the most recent newcomers in Europe, but they're also part of increasingly central, they're also increasingly central to patterns of global migration. And so Europe is not isolated from changes that are taking place elsewhere. And we all know climate change demands urgent global responses. But we also know that there's a lot of variation in the way in which people respond to these urgencies, actually. Communities, or think about what's happening in the United States on the government level. Communities, organizations, public and private bodies are responding to processes, information, and events differently. And messages from scientists and activists do not always appear to generate appropriate decisions and actions by business leaders and politicians. And so the urgency for actions to meet, targets that scientists have identified is very often only considered through the narrow lens of technical, economic, and policy drivers. And we tend to forget that all of us, we're also implicated in the action against climate change. And it's less known how around the world then people actually respond to these urgent calls or to these messages of urgency. Who is producing a sense of urgency? With what other kinds of urgencies is that notion of climate urgency rivaling, competing in a particular life world? What kind of choices do people make? And how then is, behaving or responding to climate change, valued, measured against other kinds of urgencies in their life worlds? So if we want to, and I think that's key in understanding the difference between action and non-action of citizens on an everyday level, and which means that we need to study urgency itself, urgency as a social and cultural construction. Urgency is not a fact in itself. It's something that is discursively produced, that is aesthetically communicated, but it's not always received in the same manner. And why not? Because, you know, it interferes with moral economies, but also with religious beliefs, with ideas and ethics, ideas of the good. It also interferes with the status of scientists and their credibility and their authority. And so this is exactly what we want to study. When and how and on what grounds does a sense of urgency arise within a particular society or within a particular community? When does or when will a climate emergency produce a sense of urgency? You know, fieldwork emergencies happen, or that floodings happen, fires happen. When is that then related to, you know, particular forms of urgency? How are these packaged actually? What are the social, cultural, and political and economic contexts in which urgent times then actually produce urgent decisions, beliefs, and actions? And so in order to answer on these questions, the premise of our project is that we need to produce social science that is attentive to urgency as both a cultural and a social imperative. What is urgency? Our definition is it's a felt, declared, or measured imperative to act now. The now is important. You don't postpone. It's not like religion or Pentecostal Christianity where the otherworldly, later, the afterlife is important. It's now. But urgency is a social construct. Urgency is not packaged in the same manner around the world. That's why we use this concept of vernacular urgencies. And it's a practice. It's something that is the outcome of opinions, beliefs, actions, experiences, affects, texts, but also power, who influences, who cannot influence, objects, landscapes, and temporalities. And so we emphasize the importance of ethnography. You know, just doing a survey will not give us an insight into how urgency is lived and experienced and potentially acted upon or even refused. Refusal is also part of a response to urgency. So that's why we think anthropology is the best discipline to study climate urgency, and looking at the various ways in which urgency is co-produced, you know, by scholars, but also by personal experiences of, you know, being victim of a flooding, by state declarations, but also WhatsApp groups asking for solidarity, help, activist campaigns, but then also economic schemes such as insurance policies, media images, apocalyptic images or not, private and collective memories of floodings in the past, fires in the past, and so on. As Kevin said in the beginning, the project is also experimenting with eco-ethnography. This is not a concept or a method that we invented. It's very much based on this article by Grace McCaskey and colleagues, which was published in 2019, Society and Natural Resources. But we have asked all of our 10 PhD students to experiment with it. And I can also talk about that more in the Q&A. Not every project or context lends itself to eco-ethnography, which is also illuminating. Eco-ethnography includes, among others, the participation of citizen scientists. For those who are interested, at the upcoming EASA conference late July, EASA is European Association of Social Anthropologists. It's a hybrid conference, so you can participate online as well. We have a double panel, actually, in which I think 7 or 8 of our PhD students are going to talk about their experiences and reflect about, you know, the the possibilities and the difficulties of engaging with eco-ethnography and their field sites. The panel is called Citizen Science and Eco-Ethnography, Methodological Possibilities in a Polarizing World. So I'm not going to talk about that here either. What I will talk about briefly is some of the preliminary findings. I'm also not going to disclose anything that is not yet mentioned in public, because this is not necessarily my work. This is the work of the PhD students, and they are currently writing a book chapter each. We are preparing an edited book volume in which every PhD student will produce a chapter in which they deal with this notion of climate urgency in their field sites. We've already organized a double panel on it last year in the World Anthropological Society WAU Congress, which took place in Guatemala, but we were all participating online. So what I'm going to talk about today is based on these presentations and the abstracts. The abstracts are available online. As part of the training workshop, we organized a training of the network. We organized a writing workshop in February. So PhD students are like now in the third version of that chapter. We're making a lot of progress. So one of the first insights is that actually climate urgency is situated amidst a wide range of temporalities that we need to consider if we want to understand what kind of impact climate urgency and the messaging about climate urgency may have. Well, the first dominant temporality on its own is already climate change itself. It's a process, but climate also in itself is a process, has particular rhythms, has particular seasons, which differ around the world. Even look at, here in Australia already, you have so many different climates. And so the rhythms of climate and the rhythms of climate change already are complex. And they may be read by scientists and understood in a particular, linear manner. Actually, climate change is a linear narrative. Climate as such is cyclical. In the field sites, this sometimes gets more complex. For example, Tito Moinde Kakundika, as a Congolese PhD student working with me in Leuven, his field site is a stretch of fishing villages along the Congo River, Central Africa. And these fishing camps and the villages, they are confronted with the different symptoms of what scientists will call climate change. Nevertheless, so for climate scientists, climate change is a package of symptoms, right? Along these fishing villages, some of the symptoms that scientists will say this is climate change, some of in the fishing villages, they will say, no, this is not climate change. This is the ancestors. For example, hippopotamuses are appearing at irregular times now, while according to collective memory, there was a regularity in the moments and also the spaces where the hippos would be visible. Now there's a disruption, there's an irregularity. I was visiting Tito in the field in January. For people over there, that has nothing to do with climate change. That's actually the ancestors communicating. So, and they're communicating another kind of urgency. There's a particular anger, or there's, they're not happy. They want, particular rituals to be carried out. So it's so there's no congruency in the mindset in these fishing camps and between hippopotamus, different behavior, and then maybe floodings. Well, for scientists, it's all part of the same package. This differentiation may seem banal, but it's actually very important if we want to think about how to communicate certain messages about the importance and the necessity of acting, trying to mitigate climate change, for example, locally, on a local level. So we need to understand that, there are different kinds of imagination which may be counter, partially, it's not always, binary thinking, which may counter partially scientific explanations. And these need to be taken into account. Another aspect of this diversity of temporalities is that climate change in itself has its own temporality, but then the state may also have particular, the state has also its own temporality. Think about elections. Think about futures, promises, campaigns that politicians make. And sometimes these can align with actions that climate scientists think we need to implement. Sometimes, they do not align. In Kenya, one of my PhD students does research on tree planting in Nairobi, capital city of Kenya. And she has observed that the Kenyan government has invested for several years now in tree planting, very much a kind of spectacle. They have identified spaces, and then, with the press, politicians come and plant trees. And this is all situated within, environmental care for the environment and climate change. But these are, she calls them rushed actions because they're only, related to political time. They're related to a political agenda, a particular political horizon of the political elites, of those in power now. That's one element. So the chronopolitics, there's power at play in governing time and dealing with the urgency. It's not necessarily the power of the climate scientists or their ideas about how to govern climate change. Another complication is that citizens distrust the politicians. So they're also going to distrust these messages of these politicians, and they will understand this is mere spectacle. And she has seen how then citizens themselves, they're also very much aware of climate change and the importance to act thereupon. But in the forests, Nairobi has a lot of forest also. In the forests, citizens are already acting upon climate change by caring for trees, but they don't do it in a rushed manner. She emphasizes the slow care. So it's not only her interlocutors emphasize that forests, they have been there for centuries. And you cannot just, in a decade, change climate change and get trees, popping up out of the ground and being the solution for everything. So in the discourse of the citizens, especially the volunteers that she's working with in these forests in Nairobi, the urgency is actually articulated by slowness. And that there's no contradiction there. It's actually an urgency. It's actually, made a multi-layered urgency in order to, think about the future generations. Now we need to tread carefully. Don't overhaste things, what the politicians are doing. So these conflicting local temporalities need to be teased out in order to understand and appreciate maybe certain actions that are already going on, but that we not necessarily appreciate as actions towards climate mitigation. So delay, slowness do not always mean absence of urgency. Sometimes it's a mode of managing and navigating. Second, discourses and aesthetics. Urgency is articulated in what we call, what borrowing Birgit Meyer's notion is sensational forms. Sensational forms is a concept that she elaborated while doing research on religious media in Ghana, but it has a lot of purchase here. Sensational forms are cultural expressions that have the ambition to persuade. They need to be persuasive. The message needs to be persuasive. But the way these are forms that speak to the senses. So aesthetics here, you know, speaking to affects, to feelings, and to the ethical imagination, idea of the good. So sensational forms for Mayer are a package of cultural expressivity that integrates persuasivity, appealing to the senses, and ethics. And what do you do? What do you study then? Well, metaphors. Which metaphors work? Which metaphors are persuasive? Which metaphors are considered to be too dramatic, or maybe considered to be too frightening? That's also a possibility. So in climate urgency discourses, certain metaphors work and certain metaphors don't work in a particular situation for a particular social group, and the opposite for another social group or for another community. So these aesthetics need to be studied and need to be explored. Louisa Moore, who works in Sicily, she is studying the different kinds of narratives that are actually running, that are being formulated in Sicily, which, you know, is a post-industrial society. There's more attention to nature conservation required. But one of the dominant narratives actually that counters the climate urgency is that, you know, there's a fear of economic collapse and job loss. So how, you know, so is for those people, you know, climate urgency a matter of concern, priority? Do they give attention to that? Their narrative counters then the narrative of environmental organizations that are focusing on the pollution of the soil in Sicily, and that actually that urge for this shift away from fossil fuels, which is a shift away from the industry on the islands. So these are antagonistic narratives, actually. Now, thinking about these aesthetics, so if aesthetics can mobilize, you know, aesthetics can also frighten, I already mentioned. And if we want to apply, you know, our insights of our research, we may want to think about how to use metaphors ourselves or particular aesthetics. And that's then one of the examples of eco-ethnography. Based on input from her citizen scientists, she is now experimenting with producing another narrative about climate change on the island, which is inspired by the sea. You know, it's an island, people live with the sea, with the Mediterranean Sea, and so they're going to work with, you know, the experiences that citizens themselves have with the sea, changing of colors, changing of temperature, changing of, you know, water force. And based on that, they're going to try to generate a particular narrative that can turn into a sensational form that can inspire urgent action. So the sea emerges as both a witness and a tool, a site of contamination and extraction, but also of relation, care, and imagination. In a landscape where toxicity is often unquantifiable, where official data is inaccessible, inhabitants can turn their own lifetime observations of the sea to make sense of environmental change. They can recall shifts in its colors, currents, and fish, sensing transformation through their bodies and daily lives, because their knowledge is not abstract nor detached, but it's embedded in experience, shaped by intergenerational memory and rhythms of living with the sea. And so with that ethnographic experimentation of eco-ethnography, Louisa is exploring how these embodied ways of knowing can be mobilized, not just to document the damage of, the industry on the island, but also to co-produce forms of ecological repair. Third, rhythms and paces of urgency itself. Urgency itself has a particular temporality. It's a call to act now. Is there impatience involved? Of course, and there's immediacy involved as well. But at the same time, we need to think about how to deliver the message. So meetings need to be organized. Texts need to be tested. The experiment that Louisa is working with in itself, is a particular process. So the production of urgency in itself is a process, has a particular temporality. It's not the same as emergency, although it's related. Emergency is related to particular catastrophes. Then you need a particular responsiveness to emergency, but also preparedness. There's so many preppers. They are not thinking about urgency as such. They're actually thinking about emergency. So one of the challenges of the project also is to disentangle emergency and urgency, but also to think, what can we learn from there's a whole literature of anthropology of emergency. What can we learn from that literature? How do they interact, urgency and emergency? And so far, what has come out is that emergency and urgency both, are outcomes of care, commitment, and crafts. These are very important affects and practices that we need to acknowledge. It's not just, dystopian images of the future. There's care involved, commitment, and craft, skills, competencies. It's something that happens on a daily basis. It's not haphazardly. It's also gendered and racialized. And so that's one of the dimensions that the project looks into, that certain urgencies may speak more to male life roles than to female life roles. What about people with particular disabilities? How, imagine, the increased heat of many cities, people with high blood pressure, people with heart failure, for example, they need to think about in a different way about climate change. The urgency messages need to be packaged also for these people, not necessarily for people who are fit. So these kinds of differences, they complicate the validity of certain urgent messages that are out there already, and the ways in which certain people can act upon them and not. What is important also is that we should not forget that in many of the communities that we're living and studying, that there are already histories, collective memories of solidarity, of mutual aid, related to other problems, other catastrophes, other challenges. Think about coup d'etats. Think about, so not only climate resilience programs, and we can learn from those moments of solidarity, interaction, but also failures, in order to think about how to make sense of climate urgency and the responses there. For example, Tito's field sites, the fishing camps and the villages, you only arrive there after 4 hours on the Congo River with a motorized boat. There are no roads. So how do these people respond, to major floodings? Floodings can, as I was there in January, floodings in a few hours, you can have several meters high, of water coming several meters high. But there are meteorological institutes in Congo and elsewhere that can alert people. But there's no local radio. The internet is difficult. It's very spotty. The local population has asked, and again they asked through me and Tito in January as well, to talk to the governor of the province, so to install particular alert systems. They feel excluded from important information that is specifically relevant to them and not for people, more in the interior who are farther away from the shores of the Congo River. So there is, the Congolese state has systems of, emergency, of spreading information and warning. There are warning systems, but they just don't reach these villages. And despite claims and constant requests, it's apparently difficult, almost impossible, to set up a larger infrastructure of alert and of warning. So this emergency complex, has blind spots. If it's somewhere installed, it has blind spots, and certain communities, their voices are not heard, and then it's up to anthropologists, who can sometimes make a relay, can mediate between different power levels. And then finally, what we have noticed also is that this sense of urgency also is socially productive. There are new communities, new social formations coming together around this notion of urgency, sometimes also around the refusal of urgency. There are new antagonisms also coming up. Urgency, the sense of urgency also reorders authority. Do we listen more to scientists, or do we listen more to our political leaders? Look at what's happening in the United States now. A beautiful example of new alliances, new formations, new solidarities that are emerging around the urgency complex, actually, is Metzli's project, which is in Argentina. So she studies life in and around a native forest in the northwest of Chaco province. And so, coming back to these aesthetics, she also noticed that there are two conflicting narratives of urgency. One that promotes preventive measures, guided by a forward-looking logic of avoidance. How can we avoid? And there, the climate changes very much manifest in fires. Every year, there are huge forest fires. But at the same time, you've got wood logging, trees being cut for the economy. You've got two conflicting narratives. On the one hand, trying to avoid the fires, but on the other hand, also among the communities, then more about mourning. What are these forests about for the local communities? And she has observed, in contrast to Sicily, where the two narratives are competing and antagonistic, here she sees new alliances coming up. And it are actually these alliances that we need to emphasize, and maybe also to explore further. What are their opportunities? What are their possibilities? Intensifying. So she explores these narratives, they unfold and they interact and they shape one another, and they intensify a mutual call. So in that alliance, there's a power, there's a force coming up, a mutual call for prompt and decisive action today. Produce exclusion, ad hoc social formations can produce exclusion. Here I'm going to give a short example from my own research on the side, because I've started getting interested in climate urgency itself. Congo, a major country in Central Africa, positions itself in on the global scene as what they literally call also a pays solution. That's the discourse, the rhetoric of the Congolese state. Congo is the solution for global change, because there's a lot of rainforest. The Congo River, is crossing, almost all the continent on the whole country actually. So there's a lot of possibility for hydropower, solar power, and so on. So on a global level, the Congolese state uses that rhetoric. And I've 2 years ago on a National Independence Day, I was invited at the Congolese embassy in Brussels. The Congolese ambassador reiterated the same message. We are, our country is a solution, but we demand funds in return. So the various national parks that Congo has, they are managed, some by the state, some by external actors. The Virunga Park is probably the most known national park in Congo, situated near the border with Rwanda and Eastern Congo, which is also the terrain of rebel violence. There's Rwanda, Uganda, Congo are there in a conflict regarding mineral extraction, and so these minerals then cross the borders through Uganda, go to Singapore or to Brussels, and so on. So the Virunga Park is situated in that zone. The Virunga Park is also the natural habitat of the gorillas. That's probably the reason why the park is best known for a particular type of gorillas, silverback gorillas, I think. And it is run, the Virunga Park is run by a physical anthropologist, Belgian, from nobility, Emmanuel de Merode. There's a Netflix film, Virunga. American celebrities, go there. Leonardo DiCaprio was one of the producers of the Netflix film Virunga. Ben Affleck regularly visits the Virunga Park. And within the global imagination, the Virunga Park is a space in danger. Nature is in danger because of the rebels. But then also the population around it is in danger. Park rangers often get shot by the rebels. Some die. And because of the endemic violence for decades already, there's the economy is very bad, is ailing. So you've got a lot of poverty, precarity, malnourishment, and so on. And so what we then see is that the Virunga Park actually mobilizes all these tropes around, the vulnerabilities in Congo in order to, get funds from the international community. And so this is a screenshot from their website, but they have engaged in a very strong digital media campaign asking for funds from the international community. And to think about, produce exclusion, so they address the international community to ask for help to save the Virunga Park. They don't address the Congolese. Well, Congo, is a large country. Eastern Congo is one particular part. People in the West could also, in Western Congo, could also help save the Virunga Park. They're not addressed. So, for example, here, those online can read this. I'm going to read it out for those here. So they have invested now in FTS, non-fungible tokens. The Virunga National Park depends on the support from its international community to sustain its vital programs, such as ranger training, the Fallen Ranger Fund for Widows, and the Orphan Gorilla Program that deliver benefits to its wildlife, employees, and local community. Your NFT donation not only helps to establish a future for the park, but also provides crucial resources for the Virunga's dedicated community members whose livelihoods depend on the park's survival. We've partnered with the Giving blog to easily and securely process your crypto donation. Please provide an email address if you'd like to receive a tax receipt. Choose your method. You can choose whether you're going to donate in cryptocurrency or with stocks. On other web pages and on their Facebook page, they give account numbers for visa payments. The account numbers, the bank accounts are in the UK or in the US or in France. There's no Congolese bank account number mentioned. The main way of payments in Congo are cash or via what is called mobile money, which is via the telephone. You turn phone credits into money. This is never mentioned, which shows that in the international, in their aesthetics, in their rhetorics, they are pitching the international community as potential saviors, and the Congolese can never save. They're only the victims. And this etches on, long-standing colonial distinction between the Congolese and the international community. And so that kind of colonial continuities in this discourse about urgency in preserving, in helping actually, is something that we need to still be mindful of and need to address. So, so here I'm going to close. So what this project, which is going to end next year, mid-27, should deliver is 10 dissertations, 10 PhD dissertations, in which we that document and analyze how urgency is governed and how that sense of urgency redistributes visibility, voice, and vulnerability, and especially how communities around the world tactfully accept, resist, or repurpose these terms. And so I've only been able to give some insights in a few case studies. There are also PhDs studying in Sri Lanka, 2 in Sri Lanka, 2 in Germany, 1 in Tanzania also. So happy to talk more during the Q&A and afterwards, both on the project, but if anyone is interested in hearing my experiences of applying for EU funding or running, such a program, happy to talk informally as well. Thank you.
I want to say thank you to Katrien for taking the time to present your research, and thank you to everyone joining us in person and online.
Thank you. That was